The difference between playing 100 big blind and 200 big blind poker is absolutely massive. And if you're not making these key adjustments, you could be torching your bankroll. I'm going to reveal the changes you need to make from pre-flop through the river and show you exactly how to punish your opponents, whether they're playing shallow or sitting super deep. Plus, there's one huge adjustment almost every player misses, and I'll show you what this is. Ready? Let's jump in. All right, so let's start with pre-flop, and first we'll discuss the differences between our open and 3-bet ranges at 200 versus 100 big blinds. At 200 big blinds, we're going to open more suited and connected type cards. We're going to be able to continue wider from in position, and we're going to generally prefer larger sizes. At 100 big blinds, we're going to prefer more high cards than suited and connected. We're going to have to continue tighter when we are in position and facing 3-bets, and we're generally going to open and 3-bet for smaller sizes. So you see here, this is a 200 big blind opening range from the low jack. See, we got a lot of these suited connectors in here, 6-5, 7-6, 8-7. We've got a lot of these 8x type hands, king 7, king 8 suited. You see the only offsuit hands we're opening are kind of king queen, ace jack, ace queen, ace king. So really tight on the offsuit high card side, and just lots of suited combos that we are opening. Versus at 100 big blinds here from the low jack, we're opening almost the same percentage of hands, but you see how it's shifted now, and now we're opening more of these offsuit varieties, the ace 10 off, king jack, queen jack off, and way less of the suited hands. You see the suited connectors don't even really make it in there at 100 big blinds. Because when we are playing shallow, it's just so much more important to make top pair. Making straights, making flushes is just not going to be nearly as important, because when we make a good top pair, we're generally just playing for all the money at 100 big blinds, whereas at 200 big blinds, top pair is usually not going to be good enough to play for all of the money. So we want to make more hands that are going to make straights and flushes. All right, and now let's talk about facing 3-bets when we're in position. So we open it up on the button here, and the small blind is going to 3-bet. Let's look at what our continue range looks like at 200 big blinds. We're just continuing very wide in position to a small blind 3-bet. Now, I didn't delineate here between which hands are getting 4-bet and which hands are getting called. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. I just wanted to show how wide we are continuing here when we open the button in the small blind 3-bets and we are 200 big blinds deep. Now, let's say same situation and we open on the button here. We open a little bit smaller this time because we notice both blinds are a little bit more shallow, both playing 100 big blinds here. And now the small blind is going to 3-bet. So what does our continue range in the same exact spot look like versus a small blind 3-bet when we are 100 big blinds? So you see here at 100 big blinds effective, we are just continuing much tighter. This looks like a chart that we're all familiar with. It's just going to be our pretty good hands. A lot of our suited connectors are kind of right on the border between calling and folding. That's just because the SPR is going to be so low. We just don't really have implied odds when the small blind only starts the hand 100 big blinds. So once again, the 200 big blind range, you see how wide we're continuing to a small blind 4x 3-bet. And the 100 big blind range, you see how tight we are continuing to a small blind 4x 3-bet. All right, before we move on to the flop, let's briefly talk about 4-betting. And you see here at 200 big blinds, we want to be polar from in position when we're 4-betting and linear from out of position. At 100 big blinds, we want to be both polar from in position and out of position. So what does this mean? Let me explain. So first, let's talk about 200 big blinds in position. So we open the button once again, small blind 3-bets. We are 1,000 effective. So what type of hands would we like to 4-bet here? So we've already talked about our general continuing range, but what is our general kind of holistic strategy? What hands are 4-betting when we are in position 200 big blinds effective? When we are in position and 4-betting, we generally want to go with a polarized strategy. What does this mean? Well, the very top of our range, hands like aces, kings, ace king suited, maybe some ace king off and pocket queens, so are very good hands. And then maybe a few hands plucked from the bottom of our continuing range, maybe the worst hands that we may continue as a call, usually the worst king X and ace X varieties. So hands like ace 8 suited, ace 6 suited, king 9 suited. The reason why we want to go polar when we are in position, because we're going to have the edge with positional advantage. So therefore, we don't really want to be 4-betting the upper middle of our range, hands like pocket jacks, pocket tens, ace queen, stuff like that. These hands when in position are just going to work much better as a call, but we can't just 4-bet our very good hands like aces, kings, ace king suited, or else we'd be very easy to play against. So therefore, we pull kind of the 4-bet bluffs from the bottom of our continue range. And I just want to point out here, this doesn't mean we're 4-betting absolute trash. We're not going to pick hands like king 8 offsuit or or ace 4 offsuit, whatever, right? Same exact type of concept here. When we're 100 big blinds in position, we want to be polarized. You see, maybe the composition of our hand shifts, maybe to more like king jack off, ace 10 off type hands, blocking our opponent having ace king, pocket kings, aces, that type of stuff. And this is just because when we're 100 big blinds effective, generally our 4-bet is going to be kind of like an all-in. We don't really have any sizing here when our opponent chooses this 4x size from the small blind. So having that shred of playability is less important. Having those kind of blocking properties a little bit more important at 100 big blinds, but generally the same strategy. We want to be calling a lot when we are in position. Even at 100 big blinds, we're going to have positional advantage, so we don't really have incentive to kind of 4-bet the middle of our range. So both at 100 big blinds and 200 big blinds, when we are in position, generally we want to 4-bet the very best hands, the top of our range, and kind of the worst hands that we would consider continuing with as a call. Where our 4-bet strategy is going to differ is when we are out of position as the 4-better. So let's say we open in the cutoff and now the button 3-bets, and which hand should we 4-bet here? First, when we are 200 big blinds from out of position, then we'll talk about 100. All right, so from out of position at 200 big blinds, we want to go very, very linear. And we see this range looks much different already than our in position range. We see we're just 4-betting here 10s, jacks, ace jack suited, king queen suited, ace queen suited. We're just 4-betting our very, very good hand. Why is this? Well, if you think about what's going to happen here quite a bit, our opponent on the button, when they 3-bet to $75, is probably going to have a lot of good hands. And then when we 4-bet, we're still going to have a lot of stack depth left behind. So our opponents in position are generally just incentivized to continue as a call, which means we're going to want hands that outpip them. Makes sense to 4-bet hands like ace queen suited and king queen suited if they're going to continue with hands like ace 10 suited, ace 5 suited, queen jack suited. We just want hands that have playability post flop and are going to be able to outhand our opponents when they continue as a call. So once again, this is that range at 200 big blinds 4-betting from out of position, very, very linear. Now you see here at 100 big blinds when we're 4-betting out of position, we're going quite polar once again. So you see here the top of our range, jacks plus, ace king off, ace king suited, all of these hands are just kind of 4-betting for value. And then our bluffs once again are coming from kind of these blocker hands, king 10 suited, ace 9 suited, ace queen off type stuff. The ace queen off, pretty good for us when our opponent folds a hand like pocket 8s or pocket 9s. And then we're also in pretty decent shape when our opponent calls it off with jacks or 10s or whatever. So you see here at 100 big blinds effective, when we are going to be out of position, our 4-bet range is just going to be polar here. When we 4-bet, it's generally going to be either for a very big size or it's going to be kind of for an all-in size, especially in live poker where opponents use large 3-bet sizes. So we don't really want to be going linear because in general, our opponents aren't going to be doing a lot of calling when we jam. So we just kind of want the top of range and then some bluffs to kind of hopefully generate some folds. All right, next let's move on to the flop. So we're going to start with in position, and you see here at 200 big blinds, the adjustments are we're generally going to use larger c-bet sizes and continue a little bit wider to check raises on the flop. And at 100 big blinds, just sizing down when we c-bet and generally continuing much, much tighter to check raises. So let's show a couple of examples. We're going to open on the button. In general, I'm just choosing larger sizes playing live poker when both of the blinds are sitting 200 big blinds effective, because generally players are going to be under 3-betting and just kind of over defending even till a 4x or 5x open size. We see the big blind is going to call. Flop comes jack 9 deuce. What do you know? And when he checks it over, my c-bet size here, generally just going to be around half pot, because I believe that is the size where they raise off their strong stuff and call with their weak stuff. So I go half pot here. And now our opponent check raises here, and we've got kind of a crappy gut shot. Even an 8 does not make us the nuts. But when we're this deep and we're in position, we've got a lot of options. Oftentimes our opponent is going to be relatively face up with their hand strength on the turn. For example, if an 8 comes, we just get to cool our opponent when they have 2 pair or sets. When a spade comes, our opponents will sometimes slow down, and then we can get them off of some of their stronger hands. So we just have a lot of options. We have a lot of room to maneuver when we are deep. I would call here, even with just a naked kind of garbage gut shot. Now we see both blinds only playing 100 big blinds, so I'm going to open a little bit smaller on the button here, maybe even an argument for opening 3x instead of 4. And the big blind is going to call. Flop comes jack 9 deuce, and just going to choose a smaller c-bet size here to leave us a little bit more room to maneuver across turns and rivers. So I go about 1/3 pot here instead of half pot. You see here the general pattern, smaller open sizes, smaller c-bet sizes, and now our opponent check raises. And when our opponent check raises, only has about 400 behind here, so just not much room to maneuver. So if we do have kind of a crappy gut shot here, whereas at 200 big blinds we'd be continuing, at 100 big blinds here I would just be folding. And one other example, want to talk about these ace high kind of static dry boards, because I do play these textures a little bit differently. I don't just range bet on these boards. So in these situations, I'm generally playing an overbet or check strategy because our opponents do not call with their weak stuff or raise their strong stuff on these kind of dry static textures. This would be a situation where at 200 big blinds deep, having bottom pair, where I may just run it, planning a triple barrel bluff, because I do think I can get our opponent to fold hands as strong as ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 by the river when we're 200 big blinds deep. So this would be one of kind of my overbet bluffs, having bottom pair here, because in general, I think blockers are overrated. But on this particular texture where our opponent is not going to fast play all the time, hands like pocket fours or ace 4 or 7-4 suited, having that 4 in our hand really cuts down on the combos of super strong hands our opponents can have. And I think by the river here, we can generally get our opponent to fold almost all of their top pairs. So this would be one of my overbet bluffs on the flop, planning to try to get our opponent to fold top pair by the river. Conversely, if we're only 100 big blinds effective here, I am generally just not going to be doing pretty much any overbet bluffing. Just want to check back to see what my opponent does on the turn. And then if my opponent comes out and checks on the turn, then we can just take our showdown value. Or if we just have a hand like jack high or something like that, we can start bluffing on the turn if our opponent checks, because now they have capped themselves. They've given us information they don't have as much of the strong stuff in their range. And if our opponent comes out and just bets on the turn, well, if we have a hand like this, we've got third pair, we've got a gut shot, we can just continue. We don't need to bloat the pot. We don't need to turn bottom pair into a bluff when we're 100 big blinds deep, because our opponent is not going to be folding top pair. All right, now let's talk about playing the flop from out of position. So see here at 200 big blinds, generally just a fan of checking my range from out of position, because live players in general tend to overstab and telegraph their hand strength with their bet sizing. So I'm going to check my range quite a bit at 200 bigs. And when we do check and we're going for a check raise, we need to go a little bit less thin for value. We need to be careful about value owning ourselves when playing for all the money. So we'll talk about that in 1 second. We see here the difference at 100 big blinds. I'm just coming out and betting my strong hands myself, because we can get all the money in by just going bet, bet, bet. But I'm still going to be checking a lot of my semi bluffs and weak hands. We can just go a lot thinner for value at 100 big blinds when we're playing for all the money. So let me show you a few examples and we will walk through this right now. So first, let's talk about 200 big blinds from out of position. We open pocket kigglies, button calls, jack 9 deuce. Look at that sweet baby there. Just checking my entire range, because this is a situation when we have a strong value hand, our opponent's generally just going to stab a lot on a wet dynamic board like this. So when our opponent stabs, we can put in the big boy check raise when we have a hand like pocket kings and try to get our opponent to play for all of the money when they have a hand like ace jack or an ace high flush draw or a combo draw or something like that. And we can generally just play a 2-street game here and get in all the money. Whereas if we just went bet, bet, bet with pocket kings, it would be very hard for us to play for all the money in a single raise pot, starting off 200 big blinds effective. We would have to use egregious sizes. So I guess it's possible, but it's just much easier at 200 big blinds to get in all the money by employing this kind of check raise strategy when we have very strong hands. Also, when we have a draw or a semi bluff here like queen 10, would also want to be checking, because what happens when we check here, our opponent is going to telegraph their hand strength with their action. If our opponent checks back, that just means with pretty high certainty they don't have top pair, 2 pair, a set. We've just been given impunity to bluff across turns and rivers. If our opponent bets small, that generally means on a wet dynamic board that they don't have top of range hands like pocket 9s, pocket deuces, jack 9 suited, ace jack, because those hands would just bet bigger. So if our opponent bets small, we can just check raise and apply a ton of pressure with a hand like queen 10. And then if our opponent bets big, well, we know they just have a lot of strong hands in the range, and we're just going to continue passively here as a call and not pile in a bunch of money against a range that is super strong. So by checking with our draws, semi bluffs, and air here, we just get a lot of information about the strength of our opponent's hand, and we kind of get to play perfectly. Whereas you see here, same situation, starting off 100 big blinds effective with pocket kings, we don't really have quite as much incentive to check raise, because we can just go bet, 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 and get in all the money quite easily by the river, never using an overbet size. And the thing about check raising is it does allow us to pile in a ton of money, but it does slightly increase our fold equity. So by just going bet, 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 we can often get our opponent to call with a slightly weaker range than would continue with the check raise. Now, at 100 big blinds, this is really, really nice, because just by going bet, 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 we're still getting all the money from their strong hands that we beat, like ace jack, queen jack, etc. But we may also get heroed a little bit lighter here with a hand like 9x or pocket 10s that is just not believing. Whereas at 200 big blinds, we're less concerned about winning money from hands like pocket 10s and 9x. We just want to be able to cooler the top of our opponent's range and make sure we're getting in all the money when our opponent has a hand like ace jack, which is much more important when we're 200 big blinds deep than 100. At 100 big blinds though, again, if we did have a hand like queen 10 here, would also be checking just like at 200 200 big blinds. Kind of our weak hands, our draws, our air want to check here because when our opponent does check back, we know with pretty high certainty we can lop off the strongest hands in their range, which means our bluffs are going to print across turns and rivers. So we would like for our opponent to cap themselves because that's when our bluffs are going to be most profitable. Now let's jump into turns, and we see here at 200 big blinds, we generally just want to empty the clip. They will mostly be inelastic on turns and elastic on rivers. They're going to have a lot of hands on the turn. Top pair good kicker, or ace high flush draw, king high flush draw, open and straight draw. These type of hands are just never going to fold the turn in a million years at 200 big blinds, even if we overbet. But oftentimes on rivers, these hands are going to shrivel up in value. Generally, their top pair hands are going to get way less sticky on rivers and not want to play for 200 big blinds. And not only will the top pair be a lot more elastic on rivers, but most of their draws, if their draws brick, of course the draws will be elastic on rivers as well. And inelastic simply means they're just not folding for any size, where elastic means they're going to be very, very price sensitive. Now we see here at 100 big blinds, and this is that big adjustment that I referenced at the start of the video that most players miss. Do not try to get your opponents to fold top pair. So we see here we're only really emptying the clip at 100 big blinds if our opponents do not have top pair in their range. So let me give you a couple of examples. First, let me show an example where we're in position at 200 big blinds effective. We see here with 7-8 suited, going to open on the button, our opponent calls, going to c-bet on the flop. Now getting to the turn, our opponent is generally going to be capped because they would raise off strong hands on the flop like jack 9 suited, pocket nines, pocket deuces when we choose a small c-bet size on a wet dynamic board. Our opponents are going to be capped, but they're going to be inelastic on a lot of turns. Ace high flush draws, queen 10, 10-8 suited. These hands are just never folding even for a big size. We're just going to choose a very, very large size here on the turn, planning to empty the clip on blanks because we think on a lot of blank rivers, for example, in offsuit 4, the best hand our opponent is going to have is going to be top pair type hand, and those hands just don't want to play for all the money at 200 big blinds, and a lot of their range also is just going to be draws, which are just going to snap fold on the river to any size. If we just play for the money on blank rivers, our opponent is going to be quite elastic. We're just going to be able to get almost a range fold. So by bloating this pot up on the turn, we're just creating a bigger pot for us to take away on the river. But when we're 100 big blinds effective, we're not going to be able to make our opponent fold top pair on a board like this almost ever. They're just hanging on. They're not folding ace jack, king jack, queen jack, jack 10, even to a jam on the river, because we just don't have enough money behind to put the fear into our opponents. We can play one of two strategies on this turn. Number one, we could go quite small on this turn again to keep our opponent's range even wider getting to the river. By going small on this turn, we can entice our opponent to call with hands like eights, sevens, sixes, maybe some deuce X, maybe some hands like ace 4 of clubs that floated on the flop, maybe some gut shots. But just by going small on this turn, we keep our opponent's range quite wide. Then we have more hands that our opponents will fold. We just get them to try to fold that wide, weak range that we kept in by going small on the turn. The other option, which I think is also a solid move as well, just going big here on the turn like we would at 200 big blinds. Yes, our opponent's going to have a lot of top pair in range, but they're also going to have open and straight draws, flush draws, combo draws, etc. And we can just get the draw portion of the range that bricks to fold quite a bit on rivers. And then our strategy deviates at 200 big blinds from 100 big blinds on the river. Both times we're going big on the turn, but at 100 big blinds, we may size down on rivers, not trying to get our opponents to fold top pair, just trying to get them to fold those big draws that called the big bet on the turn, but are now going to fold on a lot of brick rivers. Now, when we're out of position, same general concepts, but a bit of nuance added here. So let's say we open king 10 in the cutoff. Our opponent's going to call. We're 200 big blinds effective here. And like we talked about, at 200 big blinds, just checking range out of position. So let's say our opponent checks back. What is our opponent's range when they check back on this board? Well, we can lop off the top of their range. All the top pair plus basically are going to bet on a wet dynamic board. They're just going to have air and showdown value. That's going to be the majority of their range. Well, if we just come out and bet here, we can get the showdown value to call once and then maybe fold on the river, which is pretty good. We can just get the air to fold right away, which is pretty good. But if we check here again, oftentimes their showdown value, their 9x, their pocket 8s, pocket 7s will take a stab for us. And the air, they check back on the flop, which is nothing going on, like 7-6 of hearts or something like that. If we check to them twice, well, oftentimes they'll just take a stab at it. So if we check, both the showdown value and the air are going to put in money for us here. And now what happens is, how do we maximize fold equity? Well, we can go for this massive check raise, just knowing our opponent does not have top of range here, because all of those hands would bet on the flop. The only strong hand we can really run into here is a hand like pocket 3s, very small part of the range. So we can just go for the big boy check raise here on the turn. If our opponent calls, we just put in the big boy jam on the river and get our opponent to fold almost everything. Now, if we're 100 big blinds effective, same general concept concept. We want to be checking our weak hands, our air, our draws on the flop to kind of see what our opponent does and try to get them to cap themselves. So we check here on the flop, our opponent checks back. And when our opponent checks back on a wet dynamic board, our opponent just really doesn't have top pair. And you know, at 100 big blinds, that big adjustment we need to make, don't try to get our opponents to fold top pair. Well, if they don't have top pair, if the strongest hand they have here is a hand like pocket tens or ace nine or something like that, well, in that case, now we have free reign to empty the clip, even at 100 big blinds, because we're not trying to get our opponent to fold top pair. They don't have top pair, right? We're just trying to get them to fold everything else. Now, do we want to check raise here? The thing about check raising is we don't really have a ton of stack depth to maneuver if our opponent stabs. So starting this hand 200 big blinds, I may go for the check raise to maximize fold equity because we're going to be able to put in a big boy check raise, then jam the river. Whereas at 100 big blinds, we don't really have the stack depth to do that, but we can just go over bet here. And if our opponent calls, we go for another over bet on the river, just knowing that our opponent does not have jack X at any reasonable frequency. And we can just get nearly a range fold here. And this is one of the times where we do want to empty the clip at 100 big blinds when we know with pretty high certainty that our opponent does not have top pair. Let me show you a very similar example where this does not apply. So now let's say we open jack 10 and we're 100 big blinds effective. Flop comes ace 7 4. We're just checking with our weak hands, our air, our draws to our opponent, and our opponent checks it back. Well, what does this mean and how is this different from the jack 9 deuce board? Well, in this particular situation, when the board is static and dry, when our opponents are in position, they're still going to bet their hands like pocket sevens, pocket fours, ace 4, ace 7. Their super strong hands get bet. But this is one of those boards where our opponent might just check back some top pair. They may check back if they have a hand like ace 5, ace 6, ace 10 here. So we can't really rule out our opponent having top pair here. So when we're 100 big blinds effective, this would not be a situation where I just blast the turn and blast the river. So just showing a little bit of nuance here, I probably would just check again on the turn. If our opponent bet, well, I'm probably just folding. And if our opponent checks back, we know our opponent does not have top pair. Now we can just come out on the river, use that big boy overbet size, and just try to get our opponent to fold their showdown value. Versus same situation when we're 200 big blinds effective. Now, once again, checking my entire range out of position at 200 big blinds. And now on this turn, going to check again. And when our opponent stabs, players just let fear and greed drive their decisions. So if they do have a hand like sevens, fours, ace 7, ace 4, those hands generally stab the flop, but they do have some top pair here, right? They do have some ace 10, ace 9, ace 5, ace 3, etc. that would check back because the board is dry and static. At 200 big blinds, I believe we can get our opponents to fold, especially their weak top pair at a high frequency. So this is the situation where I'm going for that check raise and the river jam to try to get our opponent to fold their top pair. So we see here that subtle delineation. At 200 big blinds, we are planning to try to get our opponent to fold a lot of stuff on the river, including top pair. At 100 big blinds, we are generally not trying to get our opponent to fold top pair. And the times when we're emptying the clip at 100 big blinds is when we are quite confident that our opponent does not have top pair in their range. Finally, let's put it all together and talk about rivers. When our opponents get to the river and they are capped at 200 big blinds, once again, mostly they're going to be elastic with a lot of their range, which means they might fold some strong hands, which means generally our bluffs are going to want to be larger and our value is going to want to be smaller than at 100 big blinds, where our opponents are going to be quite inelastic getting to the river, which means they're not going to fold strong hands, right? So generally our bluffs are going to want to be small at 100 big blinds and our value is going to want to be larger when our opponents are capped. So when our opponents are uncapped, when the river brings in a flushing card, it pairs top pair, etc. When our opponents can have super strong hands, our bluffs are going to want to be small at 100 big blinds and our value almost always wants to go small because our opponents will raise their strong hands and call with their weak hands. But this is just talking about when our opponents are capped, when the river does not change the nuts. So we see here 200 big blinds, we open 7-8 of spades, our opponent calls, c-bet half pot, our opponent calls. We're going to go with that big chunky overbet size on the turn because we think our opponent is inelastic on the turn. They're not folding top pair, they're not folding straight draws and flush draws. We get to the river is pretty much a blank here. And now what is the best hand our opponent can have with any reasonable frequency? Ace jack, king jack, something like that. And I would ask in this situation, if we did get to this river with a hand like pocket nines, what size would we go to make sure we get called by ace jack? Probably not 2x pot, right? I don't think most opponents, specifically in live poker, are willing to play for stacks 200 big blinds deep with just single pair hands. If we had pocket nines, maybe we go 400 here, maybe 450 or 500 if we're getting real greedy, but probably not jamming if we have pocket nines because we think our opponent will fold top pair. So what does that mean when we get here with the bluff? Well, we think our opponent will fold top pair if we move all in. When our opponent is capped getting to the river, when we are 200 big blinds deep, we are just putting the money in because our opponents are going to be elastic on rivers, which means they are going to be price sensitive. And we see here at 100 big blinds, same situation, opening a little bit smaller, c-betting a little smaller. And we have two options options on the turn. We could either choose the big size, and now when our opponent calls, we know getting to the river, their range is going to be split in two categories. They're either going to have top pair, which we don't think is folding even for an overbet size here, because absolute dollars talk. We only have 375 behind. I would not think our opponent is folding a hand like ace jack, king jack, queen jack for 375 bucks, even though it is an overbet. But our opponent also has a bunch of ace high flush draws, king high flush draws, queen high straight draws, 10 high straight draws, etc., that get to this river in this manner. So maybe on this river, we would just want to bet very small to get our opponents to fold their better draws. Other option with the 8 high here is to go small on the turn and try to entice our opponent to call with hands like pocket sixes or deuce X or gut shots or stuff like that. Our opponent's going to be a little bit wider, a little bit weaker getting to the river. And once again, we're not trying to fold top pair. We're just trying to get them to fold hands like their busted draws, their deuce X, their pocket sixes that are going to be quite elastic to a triple barrel. Don't need to go big to make that happen. Maybe go 40, 50, 60 bucks here on this river to try to get our opponent to fold those hands. All right, guys, so hopefully this was helpful on the key adjustments between 200 big blind and 100 big blind poker. And that one thing to keep in mind in general, don't try to get our opponents to fold top pair when only 100 big blinds effective. Hope this video helps and turns you into the biggest boy possible. Thank you guys and have a gentle